In nomine Patris et Filii et Sancti. Amen. Today we come to our first, what you'd call like our first formal formation meeting today, as we work our way through the commentary for Benedictine Oblates of the Rule of St. Benedict. Obviously, is going to be a very good copy for people to get, put out by G.A. Simon, I should say. And as I said before, that we are beginning our first formation talk today for the Benedictine Oblates. And it says at the beginning here, it says, "Listen, my son, to your master's precepts and incline the ear of your heart." Now, obviously, these are very, very important words for us, because obviously it calls us to lower our ear, to hear from the heart, to hear what God's saying to us, and to also to hear what the rule is saying to us as well. Because if people are to go on and become Benedictine Oblates, then they need to embrace the rule with love. They need to embrace it with humility. And they also need to receive it with a great deal of obedience. So obviously we embrace the rule of St. Benedict with a loving heart. And he says a few other words here which are very important for us to meditate. He says, "Receive willingly and carry out effectively your loving Father's advice." So to carry out the advice of your spiritual director, of the abbot, of your superior, to carry it out with the loving Father's advice, that by the labour of obedience you may return to him from whom you had departed by the sloth of disobedience. These last few words here are very, very powerful words indeed, because it's very easy for us to become slothful. It's very easy for us to give our second best. But obviously we're called to give God our best, all for the greater glory of God. And obviously that once we start to fall into the sin of sloth, obviously disobedience follows straight from it. Or we're probably already in a state of disobedience anyway. In other words, we're not following out the law, the rule of St. Benedict. And he continues on, and he says that, "To you therefore my words are now addressed, whoever you may be, who by renouncing your own will to do battle under the Lord Christ, the true King, and are taking up the strong best weapons of obedience." So obviously it calls us to renounce our own will and to take on the will of God, to take on the will of St. Benedict. And obviously St. Benedict is one of the great patriarchs of the New Testament for us. Obviously we've had the great patriarchs of the Old Testament, we've had the great patriarchs like Abraham and Moses, but in the New Testament we have the great patriarch like St. Benedict. And he truly is one of the great patriarchs. And so obviously it's important that we place ourselves under his mantle. We place ourselves underneath his care. And obviously he says to us that we need to renounce our own will, so that we can do battle for Christ, and that we can pick up these weapons of obedience. Because it's very, very important for us in our life as a Christian and our life as an Oblate Benedict, is that we actually hear these words of wisdom. We hear the words of wisdom of St. Benedict, and obviously we hear these words of wisdom coming out in the rule of St. Benedict. And it does call us to lower ourselves, to humble ourselves, to be obedient, and to take on this holy pathway. So if we're going to go down the pathway of becoming a Benedictine Oblate, it will be the pathway of holiness, but it'll also be the pathway of renouncing of ourselves. Because it calls us to perfect our actions, to perfect our deeds, to make what we're doing is holy and right before God. and also that through our good deeds, that people will become holy or be led towards holiness. Because sometimes that by our evil deeds, by our wicked deeds, by our sinful deeds, we can scandalize people. We can provoke people to do more evil. But obviously that we're called to perfect our deeds, to make our deeds holy and right before God. Because we would not want to be disinherited from the kingdom of heaven. We wouldn't want to be disinherited from the kingdom of heaven. We wouldn't want to be disinherited children. And so people will grieve by our evil actions. It'll put people off from doing what is right and holy. It also calls us in our life as a Benedictine oblate to obey even in the smallest details. To obey even in the smallest details the holy rule. Because sometimes that when we're called to obey, when we're called to be holy, when we're called to live the holy rule, when obviously that when we're called to hear from the heart, that so often we can fall into the sin of complaining. We can fall into the sin of whining. We can fall into the sin of backbiting. We can fall into the sin of revenge. We can fall into the sin of calumny. And so it's important that we overcome these things, that we don't allow these things to overcome us. So obviously that when we're called to obey, we're called to lower ourselves. It calls us to overcome these terrible emotions which can overcome us, of complaining, whining, carrying on about things. But it also reminds us that as Catholics, that the world around us obviously is in revolt against God, is in revolt against the church, is in a revolt against the holy rule of Saint Benedict. As Adam and Eve was in revolt, that they weren't going to obey, that Adam and Eve were not going to obey the will of God. How much more so is it going to be for us to obey the holy will of God? That Adam and Eve fell into revolt. Obviously, we see this with Moses on the top of Mount Sinai. That the children of Israel fell into revolution. They fell into revolt. They revolted against the will of God. So it calls us as Christians and as people who want to perfect their lives in the rule of Saint Benedict, that we overcome that revolutionary spirit within us. It calls us then to meditate on the holy rule every day, because we know that it is a holy guide. It calls us to every day to look to our Holy Father, Saint Benedict, as a model of obedience. As I said before, it calls us to renounce our own will to follow the will of God. It's something for us to keep in mind, that when we wake up in the morning, that we have our half an hour of meditation in the morning. We might say prime. We might have some time of a recollection, of meditation, to plan our spiritual day, but also in the evening as well. We have that time of meditation in the evening, of a half an hour, that we read through the Holy Rule, that we examine our conscience, we say our night prayer, and we make firm resolutions in our spiritual life. It also calls us to look to holy people who succeed in the spiritual life. And so often that we'll be looking to people who have not succeeded in the spiritual life, who have abandoned the spiritual life, who have abandoned the church. They might have fallen into all forms of heresy or schism. They may be living very, very wicked lives So this is why it's important that we look to the great saints, because they succeeded in the spiritual life where so many other people had fallen away. It also calls us to have that strength of purpose to have to conquer our sin, to conquer our sin, our rebellion. It calls us to be obedient to the will of God, and obviously that obedience helps to conquer sin. It also calls us to have that readiness to learn about God, to learn about our faith, to learn about the Benedictine way, and to follow the rule of Saint Benedict. And as I said before, to be very, very strong in our resolutions. That so often that in our prayer and in our meditation, when we're reading through the rule of Saint Benedict, that there will be things which will touch our spirit, that God will say to us, you need to have a resolution in this, to be true to our resolutions. Because we're called to be voluntarily give ourselves over to the work of God. And so often we will be very, very keen and very voluntary in giving ourselves over to the work of the world, of sin. And so it calls us to every day to bend the ear, to listen to the Master's precepts, to hear him, to call those inspirations into our life. It calls us to bend the knee and to bow the head and to be obedient to the law of God and to the holy rule. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen.